Hey, I think we make a start. So thank you all for joining. We are very honored to have Imran Rasul today, giving a talk about the impacts of multifaceted prenatal intervention on human capital accumulation in early life. Imran is a professor of economics at University College London in the UK. And I'm very happy to have him because as I was a grad student in the UK, there weren't many people doing field experiments in the late 2000s. And so having someone to speak to, and Imran was very generous with his time and advice to me. So I'm very happy to have him because he's been a pioneer in doing field experiments in economics, and especially in Europe. So thank you, Imran, and I'll pass it over to John. Look, John? Joe, can you unmute John?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Robert. Good day, everyone. I hope that all remain safe, healthy, and productive. Today, we're lucky to have Imran with us. Although he likely doesn't know this, when the University of Chicago was recruiting me back in 2004, they told me that even though the department doesn't have behavioral and experimental people, there are these two young stars over at GSB who can't wait to be your colleague. And they further said their names are Imran and Uri. So, well, the next summer I showed up, and I guess Imran really wasn't that interested in being my colleague because he was already gone. He had left for London and he never came back. But I couldn't really let him off the hook that easy. Early on, I put together a special issue on field experiments for the Berkeley journals in 2006. And he was the very first person who I invited to contribute. His article ended up being the lead article in that journal, that special issue, and it really laid the groundwork for that line of work. Now, fast forward to 2011, and again, for the Journal of Economic Perspectives, Imran wrote an excellent article on field experiments with firms, which, as Rob correctly said, I think Imran's a pioneer and has been for the past 15 years in that area. And indeed, he's made deep impacts, not only using field experiments with firms, but also in the areas of charitable giving, education, behavioral motivations, and more broadly, social economics. Now, one signature of his work, if you don't know his work well, is that when you read it, you can actually believe what it says. And what I mean by that is sort of this world that we're in right now, which is grab headlines and put out these great grandiose results. Imran's work is refreshing in the sense, and this is the most positive compliment I can give to a scholar, it gives you the feeling that every rock has been unturned before he releases the paper. And I actually lived this firsthand when Imran and I worked on a paper back about 10 years ago. It was titled Field Experiments in Labor Economics for the Handbook. And back then it was a real pleasure to work with him because I learned a lot, not only about economics, about field experiments in labor, but also about the type of person who I was reading and being a big fan of for years, but also living and breathing, this person who said, let's do this, let's do that, and even beyond anything that you'd ever anticipate. So today it's a real pleasure for me to welcome him. And let me give the floor to Imran, and one of his co-authors named Lucy Craftman is here as well. So Imran, thank you very much for coming and welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Rob. Thank you for that introduction. That's very kind. The paper I'm going to present today is with a large number of co-authors, and Lucy's here with us as well. And this is the first paper in sort of a series of papers where we're trying to write around this this experiment and sort of continued possibilities of data collection. So I can talk about those new projects towards the end. So the motivation for the paper. Oh, where is it? The motivation for the paper is that there's a body of evidence from economics and other disciplines suggesting that deprivation early life has consequences throughout the life cycle. That those initial conditions that people are born with have very persistent, important, large impacts over life. And so interventions that have been implemented and evaluated to try to boost the human capital or initial conditions that individuals have early in life have been shown to have private returns, social returns, and even intergenerational returns. And so there's a sequence of papers that I've just highlighted there. There's mounting evidence along a range of different dimensions there. However, one issue with the current state of the literature is that much of the evidence base in favor of the returns to human capital interventions comes from higher and middle income settings. But yet around the world, we observe the lowest levels of human capital accumulation amongst children in sub-Saharan Africa. So I can give you a whole range of different statistics, but one sort of very striking statistic that I'll come back to is about 2/3 of children under 5 in that part of the continent are stunted or growing up in extreme poverty. They're in households who have defined to be in extreme poverty with less than $1.90 per day. And so our context is going to be 2 states within Northwest Nigeria that are very much within this type of broader setting within sub-Saharan Africa. So to give you a sense of our context, just shown here on the x-axis, we've got the absolute number of people who reside in extreme poverty in these different countries. And you see that Nigeria is a country that has the most number of people residing in extreme poverty within it. That's despite the fact that, it's about 1/6, 1/7 the population size of India with comparable levels of GDP per capita. Nigeria is a country with extreme pockets of deprivation. And some of those pockets are really in sort of Northwest Nigeria, where our study is going to be set. To give you a context of sort of the regional background relative to other parts, sort of the left-hand figure there just shows you infant mortality rates, so the rates of children who are not surviving beyond the first few years of life. Sub-Saharan African average is shown at the top. Nigeria is a little bit worse than the average in Sub-Saharan Africa. The bottom red bar there is where our context is, where according to DHS data, you have about 80, 90 deaths per thousand, so almost 10% of kids are dying early in life. The under 5 stunting rate, again, Nigeria is pretty close to the sub-Saharan African average, but our context that I'll be talking about today, Northwest Nigeria, is amongst one of the worst places to be for a child in terms of that measure of human capital early in life. So by stunted, I mean that a child is at least 2 standard deviations below sort of international norms for their age and gender. So what we're going to try to do in this paper is to present evidence for a randomized control trial that's going to bundle an intervention along 2 dimensions. So this is going to experimentally relax 2 types of constraints that households face. And I'll be very precise about the context, sort of the details of the intervention in a little while. It's going to try to relax information constraints, so information that both mothers and fathers have related to this period in a child's early life. And it's also going to try to relax resource constraints by providing unconditional cash transfers to the household. And so what we're going to try to understand is whether this type of experiment, whether this type of intervention can actually generate returns in these very extreme contexts, or whether there are other first order constraints perhaps related to the lack of state capacity, infrastructure issues with regards to the provision of health services or the quality of water that might just dwarf outcomes for children, independent of some of these constraints. So individuals are going to be eligible for this intervention as soon as they're verified to be pregnant. So this is going to be an intervention that can potentially be delivered while a child is in utero. And I'll show you some evidence a little bit later that might be particularly important, especially in this part of the world where many children are essentially born stunted, and that deprivation starts actually in the womb. It may have particularly large returns to try to identify individuals who are pregnant and start targeting resources and information to them at that point. So the types of information that we'll be providing in the intervention cover all stages of early childhood, from antenatal messages, perinatal and postnatal messages. So those will be delivered both to mothers and fathers. We're not going to try to exclude fathers from any of the information. You can think about information in this context as being provided at the village level. It's going to be a public good. Fathers can get access to this. There may be spillover effects to other households within the same village. And this is a program that's designed to be scalable. So we recruit and train locally hired individuals. We're going to refer to them as community volunteers to deliver this program. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a little while. The other element is the provision of unconditional cash transfers, and these are provided to the mother The value of these transfers is about $22 per month. And so you're eligible for those from the point at which your pregnancy is verified up until the child turns 24 months old. And you get these on a monthly basis. So potentially you could get them for around up to 30 months if you're identified very early in pregnancy. And that's going to be, as I said, delivered to mothers, and you're eligible for that for one pregnancy or for one child. You don't get it for a second child over the course of the evaluation. And no matter which way you benchmark the value of that transfer, it corresponds to about 25% of household consumption per month, about 80% of female earnings per month. That's a large amount of money to be providing. So this is a large unconditional injection of resources to households that are then provided over a fairly long and stable stream, at least 24 months for the child that starts getting them at the point of birth. And so that represents sort of a stability and magnitude of resources that are far above the types of income stream that these households are going to be used to in this type of context. And that may, well, as we'll see, shape the way that households use these resources in terms of the balance between consumption and investment. So to give you a sense of the types of information that are provided, these are the various messages that are provided to mothers. And as I said, that they cover all stages of early life, from when the child is in utero to encouraging people to attend antenatal care, encouraging mothers to consume more during pregnancy, breastfeeding is covered, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of emphasis here on food and nutrition at various stages of early childhood, and there's also an element of emphasis on hygiene and sanitation practices as well. And this is all going to be delivered essentially as a local public good. This is going to be delivered via group meetings. When individuals are being taught about nutritious foods, there's food demonstrations that are set up in each village. Anybody's welcome to attend, mothers, fathers, other households. And we also attempted to use sort of mobile phones to send messages to individuals. But primarily, just think of this as sort of an intervention that's delivered frequently in terms of the information component at the village level. And these are some of the materials that are used to deliver those messages. You can think of this as potentially very, very low-hanging fruit, very simple messages. And these were developed by our intervention partner, Save the Children, based on some earlier work that they've done in this region. Sort of a few years prior to our intervention, they'd been working, I think, on a campaign to promote vaccination in the area. And at that point, they realized that actually there's much more first order information constraints that parents have. And so over a sort of a 2-year process, they developed this curriculum, which is very much tailored to this particular context. And so you'd want to modify it for other settings. So the data we're going to have is, we're going to be tracking about 5,000 women and their husbands at baseline, 2 years post-intervention and 4 years post-intervention. Okay, so the evaluation is going to run long after the unconditional transfers, cash transfers themselves have been dispersed. Typically, they're going to be dispersed between baseline and year 2, but then we'll be able to see whether the effects of the program persist, accelerate, or just die out. The field experiment takes place over 210 villages. 2/3 of these will be randomized to receive treatment. 1/3 will be held as controls for the duration of these 4 years. We purposefully sampled 2 types of women in our evaluation. For today's talk, I'm going to focus in on those 3,700 women who were pregnant already at baseline. So they're immediately identified to be eligible at baseline. And as soon as we run our baseline survey, we immediately roll out the program to those locations. Okay, so there's not going to be any choice of those women to become pregnant. There's not going to be any endogenous entry into pregnancy. We're going to focus in on that sample of women who happen to be eligible at baseline. And given very, very high fertility rates in this part of the world, partly driven by those high infant mortality rates, we're going to observe, a large share of women who could potentially have sampled as being pregnant at baseline. We have an additional sample of 1,700 women who are not pregnant at baseline, and they're going to be the focus of future work. We have some initial results, and we sampled them separately in order to understand the endogenous responses on the fertility margin to this type of intervention. Does it induce people to become, to conceive earlier than we otherwise might have expected, given we're providing a large injection of resources conditional and you've been verified to be pregnant. But I can talk about that right at the end if you'd like to. Okay, so today we're going to focus on these women who are pregnant already at baseline, no endogenous selection into the sample based on that. We're going to track 3 types of children over the course of the study. So the first child I'm going to refer to as the new child. This is the child that's in utero at baseline to this sample of pregnant women at baseline. And so we'll be able to look at their outcomes at midline and at endline. We've got about 3,700 of those kids, as you might expect. A second group of children are what we're going to refer to as the old child. This is a pre-existing child to the same mother that's typically aged between 2 to 5 at baseline. So this is the older sibling of the new child. And so we're going to be able to track their outcomes at baseline as well as 2 years later at midline. And then for a select sample of households, we'll observe an additional child, which is we refer to as the end child, which is the younger sibling of the new child. It's possible that you could have a second child within the 4-year time window of the evaluation. If that occurs, that second child is referred to as the end child. And so we'll be able to use that element of the data to look at within household spillovers of the program, whether the provision of this information resources doesn't just affect outcomes for the new child, but also spills over onto older children as well as younger siblings as well. And that's going to be important to do a proper sort of cost-benefit analysis, and when we factor that into the internal rate of return calculations that I'll come to at the end. In addition, we have some other surveys at the community level, just measuring sort of price impacts. And we're going to use that again to look at general equilibrium impacts of the program. You know, any one given moment in time, about 1 in 4 women in these villages is pregnant. So you have a large share of individuals who are becoming pregnant in the cross-section over the course of, 2-4 years. Just about every woman in our sample becomes pregnant at some point. And so you could imagine there's impacts both on the provision of healthcare services as well as in certain prices. And again, that's going to be important to try to factor in when we look at the internal rate of returns that we'll come to a little bit later.
Just one question, Imran, from Farhan Majid, is how are pregnancies or early pregnancies identified, and how do you see that in the study?
So that's going to be verified through a urine sample that's conducted in the field. So the outcomes that I'm going to focus on are of sort of two.
Imran, I'm sorry. Could I ask one more just clarification question?
Yep.
There feels to be a tension to me. On the one hand, you want something that will scale, is what you meant, which I agree with. But then on the other hand, your selection rule is that you're choosing women who are already pregnant because you want to avoid that endogeneity. But anything that scales will have that sorting in it. So can you give us some sense of this tension? I think one important component that would be at scale that you're abstracting from is that endogeneity.
Okay, so the reason why we collected that second sample is because we thought the amount of money that was being provided would lead to those kinds of perverse incentive effects to speed up fertility rates of people who weren't pregnant at baseline. So in the second paper, which is what we work on now, we find no evidence of changes in the timing or the nature of the composition of people who decide to become pregnant. There's absolutely no speeding up or reducing of those impacts amongst that not pregnant sample. And that's despite many reasons to think that they should have incentives to speed things up. I mean, the program's not necessarily going to be around forever, but we don't find any evidence that amongst the not pregnant sample, there's endogenous selection in terms of timing of becoming pregnant, at least over the 4-year window that we can look at. In fact, all of the results that I show you in terms of outcomes, mechanisms that are driving the results for the pregnant sample are almost identical amongst the non-pregnant sample.
So just one quick follow-up, wouldn't that be at odds with the broader literature when you're talking about a 25% increase in their dollars available for household consumption? Basically, you're dealing with really high stakes in a poor area of the world. There's a big literature showing that fertility rates do change because of incentives like that, but you're finding they don't. Is there a particular reason why you're not, but the literature does?
So it may be the case that, I mean, there's particular issues about bargaining power, the availability of contraception here that may be quite specific to the context. But maybe I can come back to those results when we come back at the end. I mean, it was a surprise to us that we really find very little evidence of any changes in terms of timing of pregnancy amongst those women. There's a little bit, but it's very, very marginal. It's nowhere near as large as we anticipated to begin with. But
can I add something quickly there? They also only get it for one child and no more. So these are women who are likely to become pregnant soon anyway. So the margin is a bit different. If they were likely to have a kid, they're just not hurrying up and having it. So it's a bit different to kind of like family tax credits where you might get it for every single child. It's just for one child, which I think makes quite a big difference.
Yeah, so thank you. One child for now, but who knows, the next policy might come along and say for the second and third child. We just don't know what their expectations are, but thanks.
Okay, so the main outcomes that we're going to look at are sort of divided into two types. One is sort of for the new child. We'll look at anthropometric outcomes, focusing on their height, the degree of stunting or extreme stunting. We'll also have some measures of their health outcomes and a few measures related to child development as well. We're going to include the child development measures just because those weren't directly targeted by the program. So we wanted to try to understand whether we get a sort of additional kick on some outcomes that weren't specifically targeted by the program. But the sort of the meat of the paper is then to try to understand what might be driving those outcomes 2 years and 4 years post-intervention. So there's a lot of potential mechanisms or mediators that might be going on here. So for the bulk of the talk, I'm going to try to talk you through the results that we find on each of these types of mechanisms and then bring them together to try to suggest what might be their relative importance. So there's going to be a class of mechanisms that are predominantly related to the provision of information, such as what do parents know, what do parents do in their interactions with their new child, both in terms of when the child is just born and breastfeeding behaviors, as well as subsequent health behaviors. There'll be a second set of potential mechanisms that go through resources that the provision of unconditional cash transfers of this magnitude and for this length of time might cause changes in terms of labor market activities of households, their underlying productive investments that they make. And so we'll try to look at those changes a little bit later. And then there'll be other mechanisms that are somewhat a combination of both information as well as resources, such as how much you spend on food and the exact composition of your dietary budget that we'll look at as well. Just to give some motivation of why we think both of these two types of constraint might be relevant here, I'm just going to show you some information drawn from our baseline, where what we've done on the x-axis is just rank households at baseline in terms of their decile of monthly food expenditures. The guys at the right-hand end of that figure are relatively wealthier households in these villages. On the x-axis, on the y-axis, sorry, we've got the dietary diversity of the pre-existing older child. So this is the child typically aged between 2 and 5 in these households, as measured at baseline. So we go and record what kind of diet they've had just prior to survey date, and then we can classify how diverse that diet is. And so by international standards, you're regarded to have a diverse diet if you have at least 4 different food groups in your consumption patterns. So what this figure reveals is a couple of interesting facts to kind of set the scene. The first is if you look at the red part of the bars, that shows the share of old children within each of these deciles that has a sufficiently diverse diet. So there is a slight, gradient there that as households become wealthier, you do observe a greater likelihood of that child having a more diverse diet, but it's not a particularly striking gradient. In fact, we do observe many children in poorer households who still manage to have a very diverse diet, and we observe children in richer households who are just essentially consuming one thing every day. And so it's clearly a combination of both information as well as resources here that could play a big role. And that's why it's going to be important at the end to try to disentangle the relative importance of the two. To give you a sense of the kick that we're going to get from the intervention, what we're going to find is that the likelihood of a child having a diverse diet is going to increase 2 years post-intervention by about 10 percentage points. And that's going to stay relatively stable at about 13 percentage points 4 years after the intervention starts, long after the unconditional cash transfers have been dispersed. So that's kind of like shifting in the cross-section a household from the first decile to about the 5th or 6th decile in its population. So these are going to be fairly large effects, so we're going to want to understand what's really driving them. Okay, so let me just show you some basic descriptors of the households so you really understand sort of the initial conditions. just focusing on the control column, the samples are balanced here. So just to highlight that these are extremely volatile locations. Just about all villages experience shocks at some point over the course of the study. So these are very volatile places where you wouldn't necessarily expect the state capacity to be particularly high. In terms of household sizes, they're on average about 7. So on average, they've got about 4 or 5 kids already when we intervene. Monthly food expenditure is about $84. Remember I said that the transfer was about a quarter of that, it's $22 per month. And about 3/4 of these households reside in extreme poverty. The other important statistic just to bear in mind is that 16% of these households reported at baseline not having enough food in the past year. This is an extremely food insecure population. Many of them are residing very close to subsistence. Any kinds of negative shock, either idiosyncratic or aggregate, are going to put them into fairly dire straits. And so we'll be trying to keep track of what happens to their food security as well as a result of the intervention.
One quick question, Imran, from Andrea Kiss is, how do you handle like the miscarriages and the child deaths that occur during the implementation? And are there going to be outcomes that you might want to look at in the study? Yeah, so miscarriages, you know, are very rare and difficult to measure properly, but we will have child mortality as an outcome, and I'll show you that will be almost our first set of results. We look at both overall levels of fertility as well as mortality. Unfortunately, the intervention isn't strong enough to reduce child mortality in this setting. So in terms of—
Imran, just to follow up on that, is if the child does die, the money stops, correct?
Can I talk about that? There's a couple of different caveats. When I get to the intervention, I'll talk about that. There's a little bit of ambiguity exactly, you know, who that money then goes to. It depends on when the child dies, but there are other cases that I can go through a bit more concretely. But essentially, you're eligible just for one child. If that child dies sufficiently early, then you're still eligible for the transfers for the next child, and you'll see that coming up with a mortality rate of 8 to 10%. You're going to see many mothers who are getting the money for the second child because the first one passed away. So mothers in our sample are about age 25, very, very low levels of human capital. About half the mothers are in polygamous relationships. None of the results that I'm going to show you today vary between polygamous and non-polygamous households. And in terms of their initial labour supply, this is West Africa. So labour force participation rates amongst women are pretty high. We've got about 75% of them working at baseline. And their earnings are about $26 per month. That's pretty much the same as the unconditional cash transfer that's provided. What's the modal income generating activity they're engaged in? It's rearing or tending livestock. Okay, so that's going to be an important sort of form of business asset. If they were to use some of this cash for new investments, they may well decide to purchase livestock, for example, given that many of them are generating income that way. Their husbands tend to be much older, very, very low levels of human capital as well, and their main job is farming. In terms of outcomes related to the old child, we see at baseline very, very low levels of parental knowledge. So for example, when we asked at baseline whether you should breastfeed exclusively for 6 months, about 14% of mothers agreed with that statement. The other 85% thought it was okay to give water at some point in the first 6 months, which is kind of like against official guidelines, but even more so here because, you know, the next best alternative to breastfeeding a child is to give them water. This is the part of the world where you really don't want to give your kid water. Husbands have similarly very low levels of knowledge, and so the curriculum that was developed was precisely, once it was noticed, you know, prior to the study, these are the low levels of knowledge and this is the type of information that might generate particularly high returns in this setting. And as I mentioned, for the old child, you know, as a result of some of this, you know, these current practices, we observe about 1/3 of mothers reporting that their child had suffered diarrhea in the past 2 weeks prior to survey date. Conditional on them getting diarrhea, it wasn't always the case that somebody was sought for advice. And you'll see that about 70% of them are stunted to begin with. Okay, I'm going to pause there, and just before I talk about the details of the intervention, maybe it's a good time to take any further questions if there are any.
I think one of the questions I see is, which would be good to get clarification now, would be, what was the state of the programs already there at the baseline in terms of how they give information about nutrition? And what are the constraints about not accessing that information?
So there were no similar programs in operation. The closest was this program encouraging people to vaccinate children that was run by Save the Children in the same area sort of a few years prior. You'll see baseline levels of vaccination rates are very, very low to begin with. That intervention wasn't particularly successful because, vaccination there are many more first order issues here beyond before you start thinking about vaccination rates. And so that's what Save the Children realized and redesigned the curriculum to tackle that. And so I'll show you sort of all the baseline levels of knowledge of husbands and fathers and how they were impacted just at the end of this section. Okay, so to get into the specifics of the intervention, this is a bundled intervention. And so the key question that we want to think about conceptually is, what might be the impacts of the unconditional cash transfers? Do we think of these as having just short-run effects, will essentially be back to baseline once the transfers run out, or could there be sustainable impacts on income generation? Could there be endogenous changes in household earnings as a result of this cash injection coming unconditionally in the first 2 years? And so that's going to depend on the balance between consumption and investment. And as I've already alluded to, given sort of the magnitude and the stability with which these transfers are provided, that may enable households to think about longer term investments beyond consumption. At the same time, this is very much, you could think of this as a labeled cash transfer because we're providing the cash alongside providing this information. So we're kind of priming people that they should be spending some of it on child-related outcomes. Why was the transfer provided to this amount? So when it was initially calibrated by our partner agency, the calculation that they did was how much would it cost the household to essentially have a diverse diet here? But what they didn't factor in was that households are already spending a large amount of resources for food consumption. So by replicating that, you're essentially generating more resources they can then reallocate to other types of expenditure, either other types of consumption or investment that allows for this channel to be picked up. Okay, so the timing of the intervention and the evaluation is that our baseline takes place in 2014. We then resurvey households 2 years later and 4 years later. The program then ended at the end of those 4 years and has sort of gone into sort of information dissemination to the Nigerian government on how it might want to sort of implement future programs going forward. Okay, so just prior to the program being implemented, there's a 1-week mobilization. Everybody in the community is informed about the program. So there's some key focal individuals are involved. And as I said, to be eligible, you need to be resident in a village. You need to be pregnant. That's verified through an on-the-spot urine test. And then thumbprints are taken of mothers, and that's how we're going to verify payments are going to the right person later in time. So just in relation to some of the questions that John asked before, so if the mother dies during childbirth, then the payments will be dispersed to another female caregiver of the child. If the child dies sufficiently soon, then the household will still be eligible for the program for a later child. And within polygamous households, multiple wives in the same household can be eligible. So we don't think there's a lot of scope for sort of within polygamous household bargaining, and none of the results I'm going to show you today vary between polygamous and non-polygamous households. So we've actually got 2 treatment arms here. The one that I've emphasized so far is sort of the T1, where we provide this information, these group sessions. It's kind of like a public good. Everybody gets access to the same information. You have the food demonstration plots. We also have another treatment arm where we do exactly the same things, but we also try to provide some one-to-one counseling to mothers in particular, which we refer to as the high intensity treatment arm. So the high intensity is exactly the same as the low intensity, but was designed to also try to tailor the information that was provided to mothers. Now, as far as we can tell, the one-to-one counseling made absolutely no difference. And so I'm going to pool those 2 treatment arms for the purposes of today. And that might have been because it was difficult to implement. It might also be because it's very difficult to measure whether people are getting one-to-one counseling. In a sense, they're also getting one-to-one counseling even in the low intensity treatments, they can always go to the community volunteer and ask for specific advice. So we don't think in the end that was such made such a great difference to the program. And so I'm going to bundle these two together. So think of the treatment as being low intensity plus UCT with the possibility of having some one-to-one conversations with the community volunteer.
The cost of information treatment, how much relative to the cash transfer was that?
It turns out to be almost the same. When we do the internal rate of return calculation, we're going to give an equal costing to that. We're still trying to get the proper accounting data. It's going to might change slightly, but you know, a lot of these volunteers were recruited, they were paid, there was sort of a management structure put into place. So it was costly to implement the information over and beyond the elements that I've described so far. So there are some personnel costs. So it comes out at roughly the same as providing the cash transfers as well. It's not a cheap program. So randomization takes place at the village level. We have 2/3 of the sample, 2/3 of the 210 villages that are randomized into treatment, 70 as controls. Because you're eligible for the program as soon as you're verified to be pregnant, our randomization starts with essentially to put villages into different tranches. So we run our baseline survey, we identify pregnant women, we roll out the program in that tranche, then we go to another tranche, we identify pregnant women there, we roll out the program there, and we have balance within those tranches of treatment and control. There are a few logistical delays in setting up the payments and getting those dispersed. So as best as we can measure, for women who are pregnant at baseline, they're about in their 5th month of pregnancy at baseline. And so you can think of that information being provided in essentially the last trimester of the pregnancy. The cash transfers take a few more months to be rolled out. And I'll show you sort of when in pregnancy, mothers start to receive them. A lot of them receive them in the last month of pregnancy. So the information goes a little bit sooner relative to the cash because of those various logistical setups. Attrition over the 4-year period is 22%, but that's mostly driven by villages essentially being in lockdowns because of security concerns. So when we have attrition, it's essentially we couldn't go to a village entirely because of security concerns. So that turns out to be uncorrelated to the treatment. And if you look at villages that were secure, attrition is relatively low. It's 8% over a 4-year window amongst those villages. Samples are pretty well balanced. Okay, so let me talk about Takeup, and then we'll get through to the results. So this just shows you whether households at Endline report ever having received a transfer from the program. This is amongst our sample of women who were pregnant at baseline. So we observed sort of take-up rates of about 90%. There is some spillover into control locations. It's pretty difficult to verify exactly where somebody lives. So there are individuals who report living in a control village who then end up subsequently getting a transfer. And then in terms of the timing of the first transfer, as I said, on average, the transfer first starts to be received in about the 8th or 9th month of pregnancy, so just minus 1 month before the child is born. About 40% of households start receiving the cash transfers in utero. And that might be important given that these children are essentially stunted at birth, so you start providing resources even prior to that. About 13% of them get the transfer in the month of birth, and about 1/3 receive them once a child is born. The transfers are provided, you know, for about 20-24 months on average amongst the entire sample. The total cumulative value of transfers received is a pretty large amount in this context. And you'll see that of the mothers who were pregnant at baseline, about 8-9% of them report still receiving transfers at Endline, and that's because of that corresponds to the rate of child mortality here. So this is like for the second child, so they can still be getting the money relatively late in the evaluation. But for most of them, going from midline to endline is going to be a period when the unconditional cash transfers themselves have stopped being dispersed to them. This is what they can recall about messages that were provided in the program. Remember I mentioned those 8 messages before, so this just shows you for each of those messages, how many of the women who were pregnant at baseline can then recall these messages at midline. Okay, the blue bar just shows you the levels of recall in the control group, which is around about 10% for most messages. And we see big impacts in terms of being able to recall some of these messages, going from control to treatment, and not much difference between the T1 and T2 treatments. Okay, certainly not getting close to 100% recall, and there is some variation. Given that the child is sort of 2 years old, there might be some messages that perhaps are more salient at that time than other messages that reflect this. But you see, relatively a large first stage in terms of being able to recall some of the messages, and just remarkably low levels of knowledge across these different dimensions, which essentially drove what the curriculum stated in control locations to begin with. When we look at husbands, this just shows you the same figure for women, but now at the top and at the bottom panel, I've shown you the same numbers for husbands. We see husbands are no better or worse informed along these dimensions than are their wives. They also improve their recall of these messages by end line, but the magnitude of the effects are not quite as large as for women. And that's going to come out later when we look at their actual knowledge related to some of these practices, rather than being able to directly recall what was told to them as part of the program. Okay, so I'm ready to get on to the estimation results. Maybe another good time to just take a pause.
Yeah, I think another good question from Sarah Tuffer is, given the low levels of knowledge at baseline, might a design where you incorporate both incentives and information together would have been helpful to understand, the efficacy of information with different levels of incentives?
Yeah, I mean, so, at baseline when we were designing the whole thing, we thought that there's lots of different variations you could use. You could incentivize the community volunteers differently. We probably think that those guys play a critical role driving some of the cross-village variation. In the end, what caught our eye and what kind of probably wasn't worth it in the end was to try to change the intensity of information. How much should it be targeted towards a household? In the end, that's going on to some extent, but it is what it is, and we can talk at the end about, I'll show you the internal rates of returns. You can see whether it's worth it, and then when we look at the decomposition, you'll get a sense of which components are relatively more important than others. For example, is it important to provide information to fathers? Do we need to include them, or do they actually have relatively little impact on the outcomes? So we'll look at some aspects of design a little bit later because of those mediators. Okay, so the setup, the empirical setup is a very standard setup where I'm going to show you outcomes for child I in village V at time T. We'll have our impacts 2 years later, our impacts 4 years later, and where it's available, we'll condition on the same outcome at baseline. That's not going to be available for the new child because they weren't born at that time. But for the old child, we'll be able to do that. For mother's outcomes, we'll be able to have that specification. So I'll just focus in on showing these two coefficients of interest, the midline impacts and the endline impacts. In the paper, we do some checks with multiple hypothesis testing. I'm not going to show you those p-values here just because I don't want the tables to get too cluttered, but you can look at the paper for those. Okay, let me get through this. Okay, just before getting on to the results, let me just sort of validate one important sort of metric in our data, which is what the height for age profile looks like in our sample. And so this is just showing you at baseline amongst older children in our sample. These are the ones who are already in the household, the older sibling of the new child. As we look across their ages, this is what their HAS looks like. So this is very, very familiar to people who've studied these types of intervention and characteristics in low-income settings. We essentially see something like a U shape. And this tells us a couple of important things, that very early in life, the HAS for these kids is already about 1.5 standard deviations below international norms given their age and gender. So we're going to think of these kids as essentially almost being born stunted, and interventions early in life and potentially even before they're born could potentially have big impacts on the gradient here. Okay, so we're not going to obviously flatten this out to 0, but we're going to reduce this element of growth faltering that turns out to be so critical in many of these studies. So we're going to be able to measure that sort of 24 months out and then 48 months out a little bit later. So this just reiterates that intervening early in life in these settings, perhaps even while the child is in utero, can have potentially large impacts, and that's kind of like validating our sample at baseline. Okay, so let me run through the results for the kid, and then we'll get onto the mechanism. So let me just show you our main results. So in terms of the HAS, the height for these children, this is what we find, okay? So the format of the tables is quite similar, so let me just spend a little bit of time on this. So at midline, we find the has increased by about 0.2 of a standard deviation, and at end line, that impact is sustained by about 0.1 of a standard deviation. If you just look at particular thresholds, so the likelihood a child is stunted, we start in our control group with about 2/3 of kids being stunted. We're reducing that, crossing kids over that threshold by about 5 percentage points, and that's maintained 4 years after the program started, so well after the cash transfers have been dispersed. You're also getting impacts at the extreme of the distribution. When we look at extreme severely stunted of kids who are more than 3 standard deviations below international norms, you're also seeing impacts there. So the reductions in stunting are about 8% at midline, 7% at endline. Relative to the literature, that's a pretty large effect. So I've just shown you just a few examples here of other studies that have been conducted on conditional cash transfer programs, where the conditionality is essentially related to the receipt of information. And their studies have looked at 2-year impacts and found slightly smaller effects, which then tend to fade out. So across a range of different dimensions, these are relatively large impacts and they're sustained impacts. Okay, if you translate these into absolute height, we're talking about a 0.5 centimeter increase in the height of the children. So that doesn't sound like a lot, but this isn't sort of on average across a large sample. The difference in height between the lowest wealth quintile in our sample and the top wealth quintile is about 1/4 centimeter. So these kids are moving right up the distribution. We might think these kinds of differences then become noticeable to parents, and the whole thing, you know, they start to change their investment behaviors as a result of noticing those differences. We're also seeing improvements in health of these children. So here we just have an index measure of the health of these kids. By construction, the control group, that's a standard normal distribution. So that rises by about 0.21 of a standard deviation 2 years out, and that impact is sustained 4 years out. We're seeing reductions in sort of reported injuries and pretty big reductions in sort of the incidence of diarrhea that's being reported. Again, these impacts are both large and being sustained 4 years out, long after the program has been, the unconditional cash transfers have been delivered. Okay. And then we don't find many sustained impacts on various measures of child development. That wasn't something that was targeted by the program. Any effects that we find tend to die out by the end of the sample period. We don't get a free lunch here, although what we'd like to do is to go back and try to get 6-7 year outcomes for these children to see whether their cognitive outcomes might have improved over a longer time frame. Okay, so what's going on? What's driving all of this? Lots of potential mediators. Let me try to run through what we find here and sort of what their relative importance is. Okay, so the first set of mediators might be related to information that parents have. So what we try to ask parents, both mothers and fathers, is questions that are related to those messages that were given, but are not the direct recall of those messages. So it's really trying to measure sort of the information or the knowledge that parents have. Again, we comprise an index of these various dimensions. And so for mothers at midline, that index rises by about 0.9 of a standard deviation. And relative to the control group, it rises by about 0.76 of a standard deviation. So there's a little bit of a fade out, but there's a pretty big impact in terms of what knowledge mothers have, even 4 years after the program. Fathers experience smaller improvements in their knowledge, but these are still significantly different relative to the control group. And again, there's some slight fade out in the knowledge that fathers have between 2 and 4 years. So knowledge seems to improve at the way that we measure it. We've also got an index where we try to measure actual practices that the mother reports engaging in with the child. Again, not to repeat verbatim what they've been told in the program, but to try to get in a more nuanced way how they treated the child. We only ask this to mothers because fathers won't be engaged in these behaviors, and we only ask this at midline because they're really related to the child early in life. And again, we see a big impact in terms of that index 2 years out. So we think that information has improved for both parents. Actual practices of mothers have improved. When we look at health behaviors, again, when we comprise an index for this, we see sustained improvements in these health behaviors, and examples of that in terms of actions that are taken if a child has diarrhea. In terms of deworming medication, we see a near doubling of deworming medications being given to children 4 years out. And whether a child has received all their basic vaccinations, you see in the control group, less than 1% of kids have received all their vaccinations. That's close to trebling at the end line. If you look at specific vaccinations, say for polio or diphtheria or whatever, you get impacts of about 10, 15% on each of those specific vaccinations. So this is like saying, if you get the full Monty of those vaccinations, that still rises and seems to be rising over time. Then when we start to look at the dietary diversity of these kids, and this is combining both information and resources in this class of channel, we're starting to see improvements in the dietary diversity of these children 2 years out, 4 years out. And then we start to see something that I haven't shown you before, which is that the magnitudes of the impact seem to be accumulating over time when we look at the food security of the household. So whether they had enough food to eat in the past year, these households seem to be becoming more food secure, and increasingly so 4 years out after the program. Okay, on a range of different dimensions, you see that improvement in food security. Now, if we look at the diet of these children, what's driving that change in the composition of the diet? They're consuming more animal source protein, they're consuming more eggs and milk and to a lesser extent meat, and they're moving away from some kinds of dark green vegetables to vitamin A rich alternatives. So there is a slight change in the composition of what they're eating as well that I'll come back to. Okay, let me skip that. Okay, so in terms of the resource related mechanisms, okay, so far what I've shown you is that both parents have better information, they have better practices, better health behaviors, improved dietary diversity of the kids, resulting in better food security for the household. Now, when we focus on the resource-related channels, we're going to look at sort of the labour market activities of these women. Okay? And we can do the same for their partners. So what we see is that even on the extensive margin, you have improvements in the likelihood that one of our women who was pregnant at baseline is now engaged in some income-generating activity. That rises by about 8% at midline and 15% at endline. Remember, they started off with a relatively high participation rate, so there isn't that much that we could increase by here. But even on that margin, you're seeing on the extensive margin improvements in labour market activities. And what are they doing? That's really driven by self-employment. That's really driven by these activities that women were engaged in, which was rearing livestock or in other types of small business activity. And so what they're doing there is using the resources to purchase livestock that I'll show you on the next slide. And as a result of building their businesses, what those earnings are then being used for is part of what we've shown you so far. But in total, their earnings rise by about 20% at midline and are sustained at endline. The monetary value of those earnings is about $20 per month. So when we give $1 in terms of the unconditional cash transfer, that generates an endogenous response of like for like. There's a very large multiplier there in terms of the endogenous response of these households in terms of the investments and the returns of those investments that are driving these earnings a little bit later. We find no evidence that the husband's labour market activities are impacted. None of the resources that are provided to mother seem to leak out to the husband's business. They essentially don't change what they're doing and the extent to which they're doing it. Now, to look at this in a little bit more detail, one thing that's very nice about this setting is that ownership of livestock is attributed to an individual. So you have livestock that are owned by the husband and by the wife. All of the impact on ownership of livestock is driven by the ownership of livestock by women. And so we're seeing various types of animal being purchased at midline with increasing frequency at endline. And we have some calculations in the paper to suggest that if you wanted to buy a sheep in this context, for example, that corresponds to about 6 to 10 months worth of transfers. Okay. It's possible for households to have saved over this 2-year time period enough of the transfer to make these kinds of lumpy investments and still have money left over for other forms of consumption and savings that will come to when we do the household accounting exercise. But livestock is a really unique asset in one important regard. Not only does it generate a very stable and potentially large flow of earnings over the course of the year, it also generates a flow of potential nutrients to children. And this turns out to be particularly important in this setting where, some other work by Hodinot and other people in sort of the biomedical literature seems to suggest that the provision of certain types of nutrient at some stages early in life can really drive both physical and potentially cognitive development. Okay, and so that's what these guys are doing. They're purchasing essentially these livestock that are generating both the earnings as well as flowing back into children's consumption patterns. To put that all together, that's kind of like summarized just in this next figure. So on the left-hand side here, what we've got is by end line, the increase in livestock ownership by women, where we've classified animals into their various types, not really by animal type, but in terms of what food they provide. And on the right-hand side figure, we've got a breakdown of 7 different types of food category. The orange bars refer to the end line impacts on whether the new child is consuming that type of food group. And the green bars correspond to the ITT impacts at end line of increases in household expenditures on those goods. So you see they are spending more on various types of goods, but where there's a big discrepancy is exactly on these flesh foods and eggs that are coming from these livestock. So the livestock are being invested in because that's the women's business, that's generating earnings, but that's generating nutrition for the children that may be in part driving the large magnitude of the anthropometric effects that we're finding. Okay, because it's livestock that's generating that flow of nutrition over the course of the year, that's improving food security, not just in the most extreme season, but across the entire 12 months of the season. That kind of resilience that's building now is something that in the context of COVID, we kind of think of as being first order for these households. That's something that's happening with the provision of livestock, and it's kind of specific to that type of asset transfer.
Imran, just a quick check-in. We're supposed to be up on the hour. So if you want to sort of wrap up, so John and I could ask like 1 or 2 questions from the Q&A, that would be awesome.
You know what, I'm just going to show you just the final result on the mediation. Okay, so when we can do the mediation, just saying, okay, what makes the difference here? So here what we're doing is we're trying to explain the HAS outcome at midline. Okay, the gray part is the part that's unexplained. The blue mediators are related to information. The yellowish brown mediators are related to resources. So the blue ones here relate to, the knowledge index, health behaviors. The brown ones are kind of like labor market activities or livestock ownership. Okay, so what we're trying to explain is the impact on HAS at midline of about 0.17. What we're seeing is that information is really driving those anthropometric outcomes for kids in the first 2 years of their life. They're about 4 or 5 times more important than what can be explained by the resource channel. That's reversed when we go between 2 and 4 years out. So when we look at the end line impacts, we added an additional mediator, which is what was your HAS score at midline. So conditional where you started off from, what drives your HAS score between midline and end line? And that's where resources play the first order role here. Okay, so when people ask us what was more important to give information or resources, the answer is it kind of depends. For the first 2 years of life, the returns to information are very high, but to sustain those impacts, it's really this endogenous change in household earnings and the fact that they're getting it through livestock ownership that then is allowing these impacts to be sustained and driving the internal rate of return that we find, which is fairly substantive compared to many other investments you could think about making in this context. Okay, I'm going to stop there because we're over time. I'd rather take questions.
Great, thanks, Imran. No worries. Yeah, one question I had was from Nicholas Pena-Tenyo, which is like, are there cultural traditions that could predict why some of these households might have like incorrect beliefs about some of these practices like breastfeeding or the returns to acquiring certain animals, and whether you could like unpick that?
Yeah, so we have some questions at Endline looking at beliefs of these households. So like Flavio Cunha style questions about whether they've changed their beliefs. And you certainly see some impact on those beliefs at Endline. They're not in the results that I've shown you. Who are we crowding out here with the information? It's normally mothers-in-law that are normally providing this information to begin with. So that's why we wanted to be very inclusive, to make sure that everybody felt as if they could get access to this information. And so we weren't sort of targeting it to some individuals and creating a competition between our information and somebody else's information. That's why it's kind of important to include everybody and provide it as a public good. But just on that point specifically, one of the nicest things about the evaluation is that, you know, Pedro, Lucy and I have been working on the quantitative evaluation. We've been working in parallel with a team of sort of anthropologists and nutritionists who've been doing their own evaluation as part of, sort of in parallel with us, using our same sample. And it's remarkable when you look at the sort of the two sets of headline findings, they kind of overlap, 60% of them overlap, 20% of things they say are going on, but we don't find any evidence for, and 20% of things we think were going on, but they don't suggest it's going on. One of those things that they suggest is very important are role models. So remember, this is a program in which eligibility is universal. It's not limited to lower income women or low wealth women. Everybody's kind of in the same boat. And one thing they suggested was that when women see, you know, wealthier women changing their behavior, that's what was driving some of the results. When we tried to look at that in our data, we didn't find any evidence of those kinds of heterogeneous effects across different villages.
Cool.
That was very nice. So in the questions, Pratik Bond brings up the issue of spillovers. And just to add some flavor to spillovers, in our project at Chicago Heights, what we find is that control families who live nearby treatment families actually had a quasi-treatment themselves. And in particular, in our data, if you lived within 2,000 feet of 13, up to 13 treatment families, it was as if you were treated yourself. So given what you mentioned about the spatial delineation of villages and people within villages, not that you need another reason to have increased treatment effects, because your treatment effects are really large already anyway, but did you explore whether there was treatment to control household spillover that might be causing you to present estimates that are too pessimistic even?
Yes, we have tried to look at that. Maybe Lucy remembers those results more than I do. I showed you before that there are some spillovers into the control group. People know that this program's going on. It's sort of 10% of women in control villages report receiving the transfer. So we do think there are some spillovers that we can even measure there that would kind of like dampen the impacts. And then there are designed to be spillovers within a village onto women who are not pregnant at baseline but can get access to this information. So when we look at the non-pregnant sample, those women are different in the sense that they've received the information even prior to becoming pregnant. And because the program's up and running there, they get transferred slightly earlier in pregnancy. And so it's kind of telling us a little bit, assuming that there's no endogenous change in timing, what would happen if you could marginally shift forward the program and improve program delivery to get it delivered a little bit earlier in pregnancy. But I don't know, Lucy, whether you want to say anything on spillovers into controls.
We did explore that a fair amount, but I think we didn't come to much, mainly because of lack of power. So we had, I think, a couple of things we tested were if we removed the control groups who claimed to have received any kind of money, did the effects change? And I think
so Lucy, I'm not even talking about, I'm sorry, Lucy, I'm not even talking about that kind of spillover. I'm talking about the spillover of the treatment getting, you found that using the, I think it was a Gelbach decomposition, that information was really important. So is it possible that some of the treatment families were talking to the control families and causing their results to increase, which cause you to present results that were smaller than they should be? And again, I know you have huge effects, but just in terms of like a methodological point, I'm wondering how important the spillovers were for you.
Yeah, so a couple of ways to look into that. So our villages were relatively spaced out, but there's one thing we did try to do is we looked at the nearby markets, and we could kind of separate markets into markets where only treatment villages we think would go to, ones where only control, and then mixed ones. And then we wanted to see if these mixed ones were where, we would see kind of smaller effects because the control group might have had spillovers. But again, I think we just kind of ran out of power, but we did seem to see that there was higher knowledge of the control group amongst those who were close to these mixed markets, but kind of nothing significant enough for us to be able to kind of be conclusive about that.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Imran. Thank you for your time in presenting this fantastic field experiment. We'll send you all the questions, so thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry
And
for
I
running
hope-
over. It's difficult to, difficult to
Yeah,
That
no
was,
worries.
yeah, look, that was excellent. And I know that Pedro has joined us too. So Pedro, welcome.
Oh.
Imran, I want to thank you again. And everyone, thanks again for coming to our seminar, virtual seminar. I think it's been a huge success in part because of people like Imran and Michael and Stefano, great people in our field coming and telling us how they're changing the world. And this was just another one of those examples. So I really thank you very much from the bottom of my heart, Imran. It's great seeing you.
Thank you.
And
My pleasure.
everyone stay safe, stay healthy, and remain productive.
Cool. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Imran. Just a quick mention, next week is Janet Carey from Princeton talking about whether mentoring can help female assistant professors in economics in a field experiment. So hope to see you all then. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.